You're listening to Slight Allie from Status Stranded. I hope you enjoy. Days of research drug by like snails through molasses. The days begin to blend together like a poorly sewn quilt being held together by glue. After days of research and travel, we had gone from one place in the middle of nowhere to another place in the middle of nowhere. Every span of distance that we traveled felt like another massive leap away from what seemed normal, and another step away from our destination. Like we were wandering in circles, the verbose conversations of our travels that gave us the scenery of the stars that we wished were more simple as constellations. But now, we are lost among the images that we would look up for direction. More than 2 weeks have felt like a demented purgatory that kept us going in the same circles over and over again, as we learn what we continue to hope is important information. The Aldeporni have a proxy base in the Osti region, last updated 4 UTUs ago. The Aldeporni have a proxy base in the Gemdes region, last updated 2 UTUs ago. The Aldeporni have a proxy base in the Asgant region, last updated 12 UTUs ago. The more promising pieces of information that feels more concrete are the new proxy bases out of the hundreds listed. The bases have been established less than a UTU ago, or more promising than the ones over 2 UTUs ago. Beyond that time, they could have fled or abandoned for any reason. A month and a half felt stretched and distorted to milk at my patience with each passing day as we went to one of the regions that seemed promising to an extent. This proxy base in the Warden region was last updated 2 UTUs ago. Each second, my heart thundered in my chest. I was sure the others could hear its distress as we drew closer to the base and further away from normal. There weren't too many complicated emotions attached to what I felt from the moment I woke up to the moment I fell asleep. Anger gave me a direction, but the downcastness of my heart made fog over the instructions that I wished to follow. Every morning, I wake up to the same image. I lose him. I wish I could dream and he would be there and perfect again, but every night is a nightmare. This morning, I woke up earlier because I was losing sleep again. I wished I could have done something productive in that span of time, but I felt restrained. I looked out of the large window that took over the wall of my room. In the distance, I could see a little green planet with smaller blue moons going around it, all still and unmoving as we passed through the solar system. There was a noise outside my room, loud enough to intrigue me, but quiet enough that I could have missed it if I wasn't alert enough. On my nightstand was a knife handle. It was placed there by paranoia, and now it's picked up by caution. I opened the door and looked into the hallway. White walls and stained hardwood floors. To my right looked to be a closet, and to my left looked like it went into a dining room with a red-stained table and black chairs. There were empty plates at each of the chairs, and in the middle of the table was a vase that had pink rose cut it around a daisy by the stems. The room was lit by light morning sunlight and didn't need any other light source. I walked into the dining room and didn't dare to look around once I reached the table. I could feel her. She was to my right, and judging by how the dining room was set up, my right was the kitchen. I didn't have to see her for her to vex me. I tried to focus on something else in front of me. The window that the sunlight was coming from was a black sky full of stars, stark contrast to the light that was full alluvion in these rooms. There was a loud click that broke the silence. "Look at me, bitch." I winced at the instruction and the tone it was given in. I closed my eyes and shook my head. "No," I said sternly. If the click broke the silence, the gunshot shattered the thought of silence as the echo rang through the whole house and violently stole my attention. When I looked, Rain yelled in pain as he was on his knees in front of his mother, shaking like a cold infant animal. She was holding him by part of his back with one hand. The floor they were standing on had sputters of blood in a puddle beneath them. I could only think the worse as it pained my brain. She was wearing the same great sweatshirt and shorts. His mother didn't even crack a smile or change her expression when I looked at her. She sighed before she spoke. She shook her head and looked at her painful son. I never needed him, she said flatly before she threw him into the ground, groaning and reeling with pain. It looked as though the floor was making him bleed as he touched it. I ran the short distance to him and I tried to hold him, but my hands went through his flesh, disintegrating skin and muscle as I tried to hold him, passing through him like a hot knife through butter. He screamed at my touch, and I froze at what was before me. My hands shook as I looked at the blood that was covering them like paint. I choked up at the awful sight and sounds. I had seen Rain in pain before, but it was never because of me. What the hell are you doing? She wasn't angry when she asked that. Don't you know that tending to him will make it worse? My eyes darkened as I looked up at her. With hands still shaking and covered in blood, I took out my knife and summoned the blade as I stood up from my painful fiancé towards his psycho mother. I thrust my knife into her stomach and slashed it out quickly with as much force as I could put into it, sending streams of flesh and blood into the kitchen walls and the floor. She didn't flinch. I stabbed her in the stomach again and went deeper, deep enough to where I could feel the burn of her stomach acid on my wrist, and slashed out a larger chunk of flesh than before. She sighed like it was a mere inconvenience. I yelled and exclaimed in shock when my yell sounded more feral than normal. I took the bleeding knife and stabbed it into the side of her neck, making it come out the other side. And like the others, I ripped the knife out, taking out as much of her throat as I could. The floor and walls around her were sputtered with pulp and sprayed with blood, and she had 3 massive knife wounds on her that could more than kill any man, and her own blood was being launched from her arteries, like they were connected to powerful hoses. I screamed with an angry passion surging and scorching through my pulse as I took my bleeding knife and stabbed it into her eye, then her other eye, then the former eye, again and again, digging deep enough to where I could feel my knife hitting the back of her skull. I backed up and she still stood there. She shrugged as though I was just a child, messing with her with a stick. Demeaning. I stabbed the knife into her mouth where it stuck into the back of her throat. Then I looked on the counter and saw the handle of my claymore sitting on the concrete countertop. I picked up the claymore and summoned the 5-foot blade. She took the knife out of her mouth and her bleeding eye socket suddenly produced 2 white dots of people. Why are you not done with me yet? Her words were slow and rough as she asked me this. I grunted as I raised my blade to slam it against her shoulder, but she quickly blocked the attack with her knife, stopping all momentum. I stepped back for a second before bringing my blade from up to below to come up against her side, but again, she blocked the hit completely. With no hesitation, I put myself in the position to stab her straight through the stomach, but she parried the attack, sending my claymore to the side and missing her completely. Greatly pissed, I hammered against her with my blade, hitting her again and again in quick succession and short-tempered. Every blow I went against her was harder and faster than the hit before, but she blocked each hit with the knife like she was blocking sunlight from her eyes. I stopped and she used the opportunity to speak again. Why are you not done with me yet? Her words were slow and rough as she asked me this. My heart pounded, angry blood as I accosted her myself, dismissing my blade and grabbing what was left of her bleeding throat. I could almost touch my fingers with how little throat there was. I squeezed what I held, realizing quickly that I was holding the bones in her neck. I screamed at her, "I want you gone!" and summoned and dismissed my blade multiple times through her midsection and chest, completely penetrating and destroying every ounce of flesh that the blade was summoned into. Her blood was splattered all over the kitchen floor and walls. The pulp of her flesh built up within the blood that was everywhere. I had blood on the shins of the armor I was wearing. The essence of her blood felt heavy on my legs. One last time, I summoned my claymore into her midsection. This time, the blade was vertical. With one strained motion, I tore her apart, one hand pulling one direction at her neck, and my other hand ripping away with a claymore. I screamed as I ripped her apart. I could feel her spine popping as she grew further and further apart from herself within my grasp. After long seconds of tearing her apart in my grip, she severed at the spine with a deep cracking noise as she fell to the ground. She was held together by the skin and muscle at her side as she was sprawled on the ground. Intestines mopped the floor with the white burning smell of her stomach acids. I took a few deep breaths as I looked at her intensely limp body, lying still like how you would find a dead animal from a hunt in the woods, mutilated and destroyed. Rain made a noise behind me, painful and sad, a long groan that was so distressed I almost cried. I turned to him, and he mustered enough strength to lift his head to speak. Allie! Let her go. I shook my head. Reynard, she took everything from us. His eyes looked sad as he heard me say those words. Please, Allie. Let her go. Each of those last words sounding so final. I sternly shook my head. No, Rain. She took everything from us. I can't let her go. There was a soft growl coming from his throat as he laid in pain on the ground. Then, he strained, then she still is taking everything from you. I took the long pause as a chance to retaliate. What do you mean? You're letting her pester you, demean you, mock you. He gagged and threw up silk-smooth blood on the kitchen floor, offsetting me to a degree I wasn't ready for, buckling my knees and making me lightheaded. Stop letting her do that, please, honey. Reynard, she did this to you. There was a squishing noise from behind me. I turned to see what made the noise and was appalled by what I saw. Rain's mother was holding the detached side of her pelvis with one hand, pulling herself together, and when she was close enough to herself, she took the knife and stabbed it downward through her stomach, from one half of her detached self to the other, like she was pinning herself together. Then she started to stand up, her white pupils drilling into my skull from her bleeding eye sockets. Her tongue dropped from the back of her throat onto her chest. With steady hands, she put her bloody fingers through her hair until she grabbed hold of a sword handle. She slowly pulled out the sword handle, revealing a jagged, deformed sword blade that was as straight as a child trying to draw a straight line on a bus ride to school. I expected the sword coming from her head to be 3 feet long, but it keeps coming out of her head. 4 feet. 5. 6. 7. She was cutting herself on the edge of the blade just to pull out the distorted weapon. Allie, Rain started to say. I turned my head to him quickly, but then I heard a spotting sound from his mother. She had produced a 13-foot sword from her head. This dark, murky red blade was full of bumps and imperfections so wild and outlandish, you might mistake the sword for a large stone instead of a blade. She wasn't holding it by the handle at all. She was holding a sword like how one would hold a staff. I summoned my claymore again and faced her. She swung the long sword up against me, holding the part of the weapon that had the tip of the sword. I blocked the hit and parried against it, advancing against her with an attack aimed at her chest. In reaction to my parry, she moved the sword through the room with no resistance, destroying the hardwood floor, obliterating the cabinets, guiding the sword to me. I wasn't in a position to block this attack, as it cut into the side of my rib cage, ripping into my skin and cutting open my lungs, only stopping at my spine. I screamed, but it was so weak from most of the air leaving through the wound in my chest. Was the armor I was wearing useless? I fell to the ground, staying as upright as I could after the mortal hit, emptying out my glistening blood. Reynard struggled to continue to speak. Your anger. My anger? What about my anger? God, this is painful. The air that I was breathing in was taking in the blood that flooded the wound, creating a distorted, warm feeling in my chest. I dismissed my claymore, and his mother stepped forward with her long sword blade in her hands, her steps careful and smooth. When she was close enough, I summoned my claymore into her leg, sundering the blow on anyone else, but she continued to approach. Reynard gagged as he spoke again. "Enables." He made this awful sound of vomiting again, and his new wave of vomit blood lapped against my feet as I knelt painfully on the floor. She raised the blade of the demented sword to where the tip of the blade was at the top of my chest. The area was exposed by the V-neck. With no effort, she pushed the blade into my chest. I screamed with no support for the action, the sword cutting into the lower part of my windpipe. I coughed up more blood than I could scream or yell at any volume. The sword reached my back, first stretching the skin and flesh that was walking it before, pushing through my spine with great resistance and god-awful pain. Green's painfully weak voice was almost drowned out by the blade scraping and digging into the ground behind me. There was a short pause between this sword and the next one as his mother bent the sword downwards. Influence. She was bowing the blade to where the blade was supporting my weight more than I was, cutting harder against my flesh and intensifying the bleeding discovered I was in. For so many torturous eternities of his mother bending the sword, it broke with a sharp clank sound. She was holding a 6-foot section of the sword that still had the handle attached to it. She took no extra effort or force in doing what she did next. She slowly moved the broken sword against my face slowly, once, cutting open my forehead and spilling glistening blood over my eyes. Against my mouth, cutting open my cheeks and intentionally digging softly into the crook of my jawbone, making my bottom jaw hang slack. Against my neck, cutting into my throat and rubbing against my neck bones, filling my windpipe with more blood, below the blade that pinned me to the ground, in the suspended knelt position, cutting across the middle of my chest, separating my breasts in half, laterally making them separate and sag in utter raw discomfort, against my stomach, multiple times softly digging deep, filling the abdominal cavity of my armor with loose intestines, blood, and bile, against my knees, cutting and ruining my kneecaps. Where is the pain I should be feeling? Am I so exhausted by everything that has happened that I am not feeling anything? Not an ounce of pain? She mutilated me, but not to the degree I mutilated her. Blood filling my eyes, my jaw hanging back, open wider than humanly possible, chest cut in half, stomach incognitive, and destroyed kneecaps. I couldn't bring myself to even think about the pain I was feeling. She stared at me with her dull white pupils, a silence only cut by Rain's shaking breath and the whimpering from my destroyed chest. My bleeding flesh was sagging into the open cavities of my armor, stretching further than it should. She stepped behind me, and there was a deafening silence that was quick, as if in its place there should have been a jarring noise. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see her walking into my field of vision, preceded by a blade of their sword. As the hilt of the sword by her hand, Rain's head was impaled and severed, shaft of the blade coming out of its mouth. Tears began to build in my eyes, as I began to feel a new kind of pain. This is a pain that was in place of my muscles not being able to make the motions to sob. She was in the center of my vision now, with Reynard's head and her hand balanced upright. Her eyes stared at me, unwavering, as she moved the sword's broken-off tip into my agaped mouth. In one swift motion, she pushed the blade through the back of my throat, and out of the back of my neck, and in turn, pressing his dead face against my bleeding, glistening, painfully sobbing face. Beyond the curtain of gold that softly covered my eyes, his grotesque, pale face, eyes still open, mouth still filled with blood, was all that I could see. I longed for him to be alive, but this is not the case, as its empty eyes peered into my soul. I wanted so bad for my dead lover to say something like how he would always do. Say something to make me feel better. Say something to take me from this hell to a more tolerable purgatory. I felt her fingers go through my hair. If I had muscle function to jump from startle, I would have instantly. He's not mine anymore, but all you want is me. I roared and screamed myself hoarse as I found the ability to again. I was shaking so violently where I stood in my room that I fell to my knees. I put my hands to my mouth, reaching inside and feeling around to see the damage done. There was no damage to be found. My face didn't have a single scratch on it. My body was intact, chest in one piece, all of my stomach inside me, and my knees complete. I was wearing the base of the Archangel armor. My jacket was ruffled from my commotion, and the dress was creased and slightly out of place. I shivered in the middle of my room, my neck impulsively tilting my head backward up into the glossy black reflective ceiling. My teeth chattered. My claymore was laying on the ground about 15 feet away from me. Thankfully, it was clean. But then again, I can dismiss it and resummon it to clean off the blood. I laid prostrate on the hard floor, shaking breaths, the only sounds that filled my ears, except for 2 words. Allie, stop. I tensed, fists clenched, and back arched deeper than if I were waking up from sleeping. I turned over onto my stomach and banged my fist onto the ground. Pounding noises overbearing throughout my room, accompanied by the guttural growl of my throat. Several rushing minutes passed before I felt calm enough to take in everything around me. The stars through the large window were the same stars that were through the windows in the nightmare. As soon as I saw my reflection, a short piercing scream escaped my mouth as I looked away from the white pupils that were in my eyes. With short deep breaths and a heartbeat breaking my ribs, I looked back at the glass, and all I saw were stars. There was nothing askew about my reflection. I stood up just to sit back down on my bed. There were specks of glowing, shimmering gold across the floor. I closed my eyes and lowered my head as a tear rolled down my cheek. Deep breaths. It's all over now, I thought to myself, as I pushed away the image of those stark white pupils again. I shook my head and stood up. I collected and dismissed my claymore before slowly walking to my door. Every few steps to my door, I stopped and took a deep breath as I pushed away all those white eyes. All until I finally reached the door. I waited for there to be any outlier noise. None, with only silence and the hum of the spacecraft as we flew through the void. I opened the door, and to my relief, there was a normal ship's hallway on the other side of the door. I went up to the bridge of the ship. From what I could see of the maps and charts on the different screens, we were almost to where we wanted to be, Haiti. Nearby Haiti, there was a space station that we were interested in. Information about this station is as current as less than a UT ago. Before this morning, I wasn't looking forward to coming here, but now, after this morning, I was dreading the idea entirely. Could this be a cloning facility? Or could it be something as simple as weapons stock? Or is this one of their experimental facilities where they were constantly working on new technologies? Nonetheless, whether I like it or not, it's necessary, and necessary is going to be a pain to deal with at first. As I walked through the bridge, I could see the planet off to the side of the view through the window. It was a golden-colored planet that had deep blue accents that were contrasted by the orange sun beyond it. Growing up, reading, and hearing stories of heroes and villains, I always noticed how the bad guys were always in such dark and scary places to live in. But, in reality, that isn't the case. The bad guy just lives where he wants to, and sometimes the atmosphere of beautiful scenery is only tainted by the fact that the bad guy is here. I spoke an order into one of the radios for me to be transported to the Brecton mothership. Within the next few seconds, I was teleported from where I stood on my ship to the bridge of the Brecton mothership. The bridge of this ship was like being in the middle of a glass chandelier, full of reflections and refractions as all kinds of light filtered through the glass-like material. Hasuna sat upon her captain's chair, back of the chair padded and standing taller than her head by a few inches. There were 2 rows of systems in front of her for navigation, in-ship monitoring, and research. Hasuna turned to look at me, and asked who all is going into ambush against the base. I told her that she can bring a handful of her best, and I'll bring a few of us from our group to infiltrate. She told me that she has some fighters in mind. She said that with a smirk. More defensively than I would have liked. I told her that I want information more than carnage, but rest assured, valiant warrior, you will get your fill of blood today. She smiled. I asked how Anton was doing since the last time I checked in on him. She told me that he's gotten to the point where he's stable now, but the burns were still in a state where they weren't healing as fast as we would like them due to his body rejecting assistance from the different treatments that were available. They were able to make his stomach a closed organ again, but it's hardly functional, let alone the fact that his intestines were unrecoverable after the hit. I was saddened even more at the news. He was so passionate fighting for the group. He's fearless too, and he reaped the fruits of his fearlessness. Nonetheless, I had in mind the small number of fighters that I'm bringing with us. I still have Titos and Adore, and a few of the Soda have stepped up to fight on my side as well. Their names are Sacramore and Olwen, brother and sister who grew up in a rough part of the universe after the acid eviscerated the galaxy that used to have the Soda homeworld. The acid, mold, Takil, Mala, Haibu, whatever people call it. The one thing the fearless fear, the Oddporny are afraid of what they call Haibu. The Soda are afraid of what they call Enspielung. As for me, I've only heard stories about the unrelenting wall that devours societies. I've been told what to fear, but I've not seen it for myself. It's undeniable the acid exists, but what keeps going through my mind is the thought that you could avoid it while sitting in the middle of it because of how big it is, like how a fishnet cannot catch the small fish in the river. Next, we suit up to ambush. I already have everything I need for this excursion. The only outliers I need to account for were boots and a helmet. I could wear combat boots like the kinds I've worn before with no consequence, but when going against the Oddporny, identity is an essential security that I don't want to lose. I was reminded of the helmet that came with my armor. It was designed to look like an olive oil of the brass. I fastened it to my hair and looked at my reflection in the glass. I hadn't worn it before, and looking at it now, it almost looks like a crown. I closed my eyes and opened them again before I summoned the helmet. The helmet made a clang noise, and before me was the helmet with white pupils showing through it. Instantly, I dismissed the helmet, revealing my face pale in shock from what I had just seen. I jumped again when I thought I saw the light hardly showing in my own pupils, but I had concluded it was merely a reflection off of some white light out there. After I was calm enough to remember what I was doing again, I resummoned the helmet. The area around the eyes were soft, and instead of the haunting white in the eyes, there was a glowing gold and a hint of ruby within the shine. Within the bridge of the nose to below my chin, there was an almost black burgundy rose angled downward, and the scalp of the head was made up of rose leaves, made of brass with dark red accents where the creases were. It would predict my identity, but it damn sure is unforgettable. I had my claymore in hand and summoned it so I could see the full set. Armor, weapon, helmet, and all. This was a figure that wouldn't come around the corner sneaking up on you quietly, but instead, it would dominate your attention as you cower in awe and fear as I stand above you. I grimaced under the cover of the helmet, and turned to leave my room, and be transported into the Oddporny base. Last updates before boarding the base. It appears to be a multi-purpose base. It has a cloning faction and additional data backups. The base itself was bright reflective silver. One side of the base looked like a flat pyramid made up of triangular grid lines. The other side looked like a row of discs stacked on top of each other, but they had a disk width of space in between each other, and there was a dozen or so of them. The section with the disc were 3 times as large as the pyramid part of the base, and our scans were showing that this structure was 2.5 miles from one far end to the other. The scans read that the cloning wards were where the discs were, and all the other facilities were in the pyramid. The last thing we learned from the base before making the final actions to board was that there were seemingly random locations on the base that we weren't able to use the teleporters on. The entire cloning ward being one of these places, as well as strung out locations in the other facility part of the base. I told those of my crew that were still on my ship and part of my fleet that if anything were to go wrong, call Arth Gallo from wherever he was and demand his assistance. I know it would take less than demanding for his assistance, but I know that word use was important as far as giving orders is concerned. I collected the fighters that I wanted to bring, and we waited in one of the arenas in the Breckton mothership until we would be teleported to the station. Where do we go from there? In the end, I believe we can cripple the Otporny race to the extent that they fall to shambles from whatever hierarchy that they have placed themselves in. But for now, we will use whatever we find in this space as a stepping stone, importantly liminal to the fall of the Otporny. I don't want to destroy them. I want them to know the same anger that I know. I want enough of them left to look at the shattered pieces of their society and wish they could have done more. But with their resources and bleeding broken shards in my fist, they have exactly what I had from the beginning of all this: no hope of revenge. I continued to think to myself as we were teleported to the base. We were in an empty corridor within the base, near the center of the facility ward. As for me, I was able to take this help and taint it into a drive for revenge, a necessity in my case, but an asset that the survivors won't have the luxury of cherishing. The corridor we were inside was a few hundred feet long. There were steel blue walls with different piping and light designs stitched within them. The designs were an interlocking repeating pattern made up of different shaped squares and diamond outlines. The floor was a glossy white that illuminated the space above it, lighting everything from below. The ceiling had no detail to it. It was simply a black void above us, like the whole space in general. We have little to no knowledge of what to expect as far as defense or security goes for this base. In our group, we had myself, Titos, Adore, Sagarmore, and Olwen. Hasuna had her own small group of fighters, including herself. There was also Delmont, who seemed to be bigger in this tighter corridor than out on the streets of a city. He had a helmet on that was more like a welding mask. She had only 2 others with her besides Delmont. At first they didn't seem to take on too much of a form, but within a few minutes of us walking through the corridor to the next room or section, they had taken on 2 different forms, a human-like fox and a human-like owl. I was told that the fox was named Dupiri, and that the owl was named Unis. The only problem that I could see as far as maneuverability went was the fact that Delmont's anchor sword was too big to fit inside this space. But from what I could have seen, he has other methods of fighting besides his weapon. Maybe not as big of a problem as I had thought initially, but it came to mind as such. The area in front of us was one of those locations that we weren't able to teleport to. Tactically, this gives a pretext that this section was important enough to limit outside access to. I don't know how long it will take before there was any reaction from the Outbornies or any system that they have, but still, we are making ourselves to be cautious. We walked into the next room and took in the contents. There were rows and rows of dark green domes that were about 3 feet tall and 6 feet wide with triangular panels. The panels had some kind of writing on them that was scrolling at a pace that I didn't bring myself to read even if it were a language I understood. This room was longer than the corridor we were teleported in, and the ceiling was higher as well. Within the ceiling were blue diamonds that gave off red light and were projecting a thin beam of light into each of the domes that were directly below them. It was then that I noticed a distinction within each of the domes. Each dome had enough transparency to barely see through, and inside of the domes was a chamber that went a few dozen feet below the ground and enclosed more space than there was a capacity for. Floating just below each of the domes were single aliens of different races. There were golden tubes feeding into each of the different aliens that were within each dome. They were comatose as they were suspended in what appeared to be nothing. As I was studying the different aliens under the domes, one of them opened their eyes, revealing white pupils. I was painfully entranced as I observed the body of the alien that also looked like her. I took a step back before regaining my sense again, and I peered back into the dome and saw that there were no white pupils, and this strange alien looked nothing like her. I decided it was nothing, but my pounding heart was telling me otherwise. Looking into some of the other domes, I noticed them to be empty, and at that time, Owen realized that the symbols covering the domes were some kind of runes or lettering. She read a few of the bold words that were on the domes, but nothing sounded familiar, until she read one that said Fortis, and a moment later, there was one with Seru written on it. Both of those domes were empty. Soto was also empty, but I almost froze when I stood in tension, as there was awful reverberating noise, An alarm with a low tone that sounded like a jackhammer against my eardrums. Before the alarm went off, Owen was able to read off one more word before she was interrupted. Human.
Hi, this is David Halen, and you just finished listening to Slight Allie from my story, Status Stranded. I hope you enjoy. See you next week.